There's something that we call, in the States at least, Miranda rights. And they are, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. There was a comedian on TV sometimes ago said, I had the right to remain silent, but I didn't have the ability. That sometimes describes us. In Canada, we have a similar set of rights. I'm not sure if these are supposed to be read as worded here, but anything you say can be used as evidence against you. You have the right to speak to a lawyer. You have the right to contact your parents or guardian, and you have the right to have your parents or guardian and a lawyer with you if you want them there when the police question you. Personal rights and freedoms. Over the last couple of years especially, there's been much discussion about them. Who grants them, and to whom are they granted? When are they violated, or what constitutes a violation of them? Can they be stolen, or are they being stolen? Are they relinquished? The U.S. Bill of Rights, which largely talks about the right of everyone to equality and to the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, however that's defined, is something that we're familiar with. Canadian Charter of Human Rights is similar, but it's not identical. It's more specific in some ways. Governments can declare some rights to be transferable or non-transferable, able to be sold or traded, or not able to be taken away. Different governments can choose not to permit human rights, and of course, there have been flagrant violations around the world of that kind of thing, and the United Nations stands in opposition to that. The Apostle Paul, in the book of Acts, invoked his rights, but in a very gentle way. He didn't demand them. He simply questioned, is what you're doing legal? Can you do this to a Roman citizen without him having been tried or found guilty? But his assertion there, and even more so in the story we're going to be talking about this week in Acts 22 and 23 and 24, it was a double-edged sword. It stopped the torture and interrogation right away, and it saved him from the unruly Jewish mob. But ultimately, it also obligated the officials to surrender him to those in authority above them, as opposed to just simply releasing him on lack of evidence. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I kind of played with some of the legal phrasing, and if it's out of order or in the wrong words, sue me.
No, don't.
For everything I'm worth. Just be warned, that's not a lot. Acts 22:30. The next day, since the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. The first verse of Acts 23, Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in clear conscience to this day." Paul had been in the process of being beaten to death by the Jewish crowd. He'd been cited in Jerusalem along with a Gentile from Ephesus. They wrongly assumed that he had gone to the temple with this Gentile and had defiled the temple, and that was a major no-no in terms of the law. So his question regarding the legality of this process gave him a reprieve. The commander wanted to know the cause of this disturbance, and so he brought Paul out to the chief priests and Sanhedrin. And his reply, his opening statement, if you will, is he had conducted himself in a manner above reproach. He had a clear conscience. Well, apparently, the chief priest figured this was Paul being in contempt. At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, and yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. Those who were standing near Paul said, You dare to insult God's high priest? Paul replied, Brothers, I didn't realize he was the high priest. For it is written, Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people. Now, the chief priest Ananias was known for his brutality and violence. And he took umbrage at what Paul had said about serving God and doing so with a clear conscience. And so he ordered those near Paul to strike him on the mouth. And Paul had a right to pronounce a curse. This was not according to the way that the law should have been enacted. And the Jews did have a certain amount of autonomy, but they acted under Roman authority with certain limitations. And so they had the right to prosecute in some ways the way they saw fit. But Paul thought Ananias greatly exceeded his authority. In his mind, Ananias was out of line. He was out unjust. But this was the high priest. And so Paul quickly retracted his curse. According to the law, he was out of order. And as his defense relied on respect for and adherence to the law, he wanted to set right this infraction. Order in the court. There was a major kerfuffle about to happen here. Verse 6. Then Paul, knowing some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, My brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. I stand on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection of the dead, and neither are there angels or spirits. But the Pharisees acknowledged them all. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man, they said. What if a spirit or an angel had spoken to him? The dispute became so violent, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. So he ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him back into the barracks. This was strategic on Paul's part. He knew he couldn't win a confrontation with this group who collectively were the Sanhedrin. They were made up of some Pharisees and some Sadducees, and they had a major rift between them regarding the resurrection of the dead. So he kind of threw out that bone, and they both jumped on it and started picking away at it and fought each other. The commander knew that Paul was in fear of his life, really, and so he took him back into the barracks, the Antonia fortress. The following night, the scripture concludes in that passage, the Lord stood near Paul and said, Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. So there was a promise there that would be fulfilled as Paul continued to act in the way that the story plays out. See, there was a conspiracy that came up as a result of this. Verse 12, the next morning the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about the case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here. Very typical of an awful lot of action, suspense, and intrigue type movies. There was a plot to attack the convoy while it was in transit back to the public square. And there they were intending to kill him. And they were going to fast until this had been accomplished. Now remember, defiling the temple, that is bringing a Gentile, a non-Jew, into the area reserved specifically and only for the Jews, that was defiling the temple, and it was something that was punishable by death under Jewish law. And so they would have felt entirely justified in their plan. They would have had the blessing of the chief priests and elders to whom they told the plan. They actually enlisted the Sanhedrin's help. Here's what you do. Ask for more details about the case. Ask that Paul be presented before you. And in transit, we'll get him. Well, now there's a little bit of intrigue, almost a little bit of espionage. When the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and he told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So he took him to the commander, and the centurion said, "Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" He said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man and cautioned him, "Don't tell anyone that you've reported this to me." Then he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide mounts for Paul so that he may be taken safely to the governor Felix." Paul's sister's son, if you're keeping track, that's Paul's nephew. And he heard of the plot. Somehow he had access to this discussion between this 40-man contingent and the Sanhedrin. And so he told his uncle Paul. Somehow he had access to Paul in the barracks. And Paul asked the centurion to ask the young man to take him to the commander. And it's interesting because obviously this young man would have been of an age or standing or something that he would have had credibility in this matter. And so he was to tell the commander what these 40 men had planned. Now, for the commander, there would have been repercussions too, because any prisoner killed under his watch would reflect very badly on him, and he had something to lose. And so he said, "Thank you for telling me. You've told me. Keep quiet about it. Don't let any word of this leak out." And then the commander took really significant measures. It lists 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. Now, I'm not noted for my math skills, but I can do some basic addition. That's 470 men armed to accompany Paul, maybe a very small group of companions with him, to Caesarea. Doesn't that sound a little bit like overkill? No pun intended. No pun intended. But 470 men. Guess it was a pretty significant crowd. The Sanhedrin usually amounted to about 70 men, and then there would probably be a contingent of their supporters and followers as well. So they were prepared for what could have been a significant armed conflict. Well, here we get into a situation where it's referred to a higher court. Not sure if that's called a continuance or not. But so verse 25 says, "Provide mounts for Paul so that he may be taken to safety to the governor Felix." And he wrote a letter, "Claudius Lysias, to his excellency, Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops, and I rescued him, for I learned that he was a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusations had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present you their case against him." So Paul was once again remanded. This is the second night he would have been in those barracks, because the first time he was carried out by the soldiers into the fortress because the mob was after him. Then he ticked off the Sanhedrin next morning when the commander had brought him out in front of the crowd to talk to them. And so there is a changing of the venue. Here's the thing. The guy was at the heart of a great disturbance among his own people. But here's the catch. He's a Roman citizen. I put him under guard because they were going to kill him. I figured out this was an internal dispute. He's not broken any Roman law. He doesn't deserve prison or death as far as we're concerned. I've taken measures to get him out of here safely so he can appear before you in safety, and I've also commanded his accusers to be present before you, and you can listen to their story if they show up. Verse 31, so the soldiers carrying out their orders took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day they let the cavalry go on with him while they returned to the barracks. Antipatris is what's now actually a national park, just a little bit to the north of Jerusalem. So they took him out of the city of Jerusalem to this place where obviously they had a further, can't think of the word, but presence there, a camp. And from there, then the cavalry took him on to Caesarea, which was a day or two's travel north. And he was in protective custody. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the government and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked, "What province are you from?" Learning that Paul was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers get here." And then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. So Paul was handed over to this guy Felix, and Cilicia, which is the province or territory where Tarsus is, which was Paul's hometown, he figured out that was under his jurisdiction, and so he had the right to detain Paul until the Sanhedrin arrived. Well, now there is, if you will, witness for the prosecution through their mouthpiece, a lawyer. Verse 24, verse 1, chapter 24, verse 1. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer whose name was Tertullus. And they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented his case before Felix. And the translation, I'm not sure if that has to do with how lawyers typically sound in court. They didn't have access, obviously, to TV, but I kind of hear that atmosphere. "We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix. We acknowledge this with profound gratitude. But in order not to weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world." Or in Jerusalem, whichever comes first. "He's a ringleader of the Nazarene sect and even tried to desecrate the temple. So we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about all of these charges we're bringing against him." The Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. Kind of a flowery and ingratiating speech, wasn't it? Well, now there's witness for the defense. Verse 10, when the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, "I know for a number of years you've been a judge over this nation, so I gladly will make my defense. You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago I went to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple, nor stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or anywhere in the city. They can't prove to you the charges they are now making against me. I admit that I worship the God of our fathers as a follower of the way, or Christians, or Christianity, faith in Jesus, which they call a sect. I believe everything that agrees with the law and that has been written in the prophets, and I have the same hope in God as these men, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. After a brief absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. We saw that in the story last week, how he was urged by his brothers and sisters in Jerusalem to join these four men in their Nazaritic vow, probably, and to have his head shaved and to pay for their fees and their offerings. And so he was just at the tail end of that week of purifications. And he continues on in this defense. I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. But there are some Jews from the province of Asia. And the province of Asia is at the west end of Asia Minor, which is now modern-day Turkey. And Ephesus is just about on the coast there. There. I'll do this backwards for your sake. Here's Turkey, there's Ephesus. They came all the way around and down into Jerusalem. Whether they were there to have their own pilgrimage to the temple or whether they were following and dogging Paul wasn't made clear. But there are these Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring their charges if they have anything against me. Or these who are here should state what crime they found me in when I stood before the Sanhedrin. Unless it was this one thing that I shouted as I stood in their presence. It's concerning the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you today. Well, there's no change of venue, but there is a new jurisdiction that's about to happen. Verse 22, then Felix, well acquainted with the way, adjourned proceedings. When the commander comes, Lysias was the guy who wrote the letter, I'll decide your case. He ordered the centurions to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. Pretty lenient circumstances under the situation there. Several days later, Felix came in with his wife, Drusilla, who was a Jewess. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Jesus Christ. As Paul discoursed on righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, that's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you. At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe. So he sent frequently for him and talked with him. After 2 years, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. But because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. Chapter 25. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They urgently requested Festus as a favor to them to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me and press charges against the man there if he's done anything wrong. After spending 8 or 10 days with them, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul appeared, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. Then Paul made his defense. I have done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. Festus And his proposal is what prompted Paul's appeal to his rights. Wishing to do the Jews a favor, Festus said to Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on those charges?" So up is down and down is up. Everywhere from around Jerusalem was up to Jerusalem, and anywhere away, south, north, east, or west, was down from Jerusalem. And so at Caesarea, Festus said, "Why don't you come up with me to Jerusalem and you can stand on trial there?" Paul answered, "I'm now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I've not done anything wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. However, if I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. Here's the claim. I appeal to Caesar." After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, "You have appealed to Caesar you will go." You see, Festus's proposal would have been illegal, not necessary under Jewish or Roman law, and it would have been lethal to Paul. And Paul wasn't willing just to be handed over to the Jews or to fall into their hands in any way. He knew he wouldn't survive. But there was also God's promise. Remember back a little ways? The Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." Once again, Paul invoking his rights was strategic. It saved his life. And it actually played into the fulfillment of God's promise. It did not guarantee his freedom. He would be held for a while longer in Rome under house arrest before he was released. He didn't demand his rights, and he had no illusions that he was invincible or immune to potential consequences. He knew that he was subject to the whim of the Roman rulers. Why is this passage important to us today? It seems kind of like a story with a lot of legal setting. Well, as I mentioned earlier, there has been a lot of discussion about rights and those rights being violated or eroded or simply overturned, whether it has to do with the restrictions that have been imposed by governments at various levels because of COVID, or the masking mandates, or even a potential for mandatory vaccines. There have been some people that have been really up in arms about this. And I don't usually get into political stuff, especially not during an election, but I think that this passage has some things to say to us. If we choose civil disobedience in any respect, we need to be prepared to face the consequences. I refer back to the earlier passages in Acts where Peter and John were in the courtyard and they were preaching Christ, and they were ordered before the local authorities, and the local authorities commanded them specifically against what Jesus had told them to be and to do. You will be my witnesses. You will speak of the things that you have seen and heard. And these authorities were saying, you will not preach in the name of Christ any longer. It's a direct confrontation between what Jesus told his disciples and what the civil authorities were telling them. In that case, Peter and John said, you tell us not to, but tell us which is right, to obey God or to obey human authority. They chose to preach Christ, and they were imprisoned and beaten and then released. Their rights nor ours allow us to flout the law or to act with impunity. But just where that line is drawn is really hard to determine. It does depend on a case-by-case situation. Depends on circumstances and on the individual as well. I will go on record as saying that I believe that the government has imposed temporary measures on a health crisis basis to protect the community at large, or the population at large. I believe it's temporary. I don't believe that it is motivated by any conspiracy against Christians or against Canadian rights or anything else, but to try to keep the pandemic at bay. The same with vaccines and the urge to be vaccinated, no matter from what governmental authority or private authority there might be, or public opinion for that matter. I myself have been vaccinated twice. I respect the choices of those who choose not to be vaccinated. Should be aware that the vast majority of the cases now in hospitals are actually non-vaccinated people. They have that right. In the case of some churches around Alberta, they flouted the law, and we're going to continue to hold services with as many people and disregard all of the precautions and all the rest of it. And then when the authorities came and said, you really can't do that, this is the mandate that everybody in the province is under. Everybody, not just the Christians, Muslims, Masons, community town halls, everybody was restricted to certain numbers. And during that time, we tried to comply with that as well. And so some of those people were prosecuted, either as individuals or as a group. Not all prosecution is persecution. And the rights that we have as Canadian citizens aren't necessarily the rights that we can expect as Christians. Even if it is persecution, you've got to remember that Jesus was born into a society that opposed faith in Yahweh. Though the Jews had limited freedom to do so, they pressed for his death, and it was the Romans who ultimately gave them the authority to crucify Jesus. Rome's official stance was leave them be unless they get out of hand or break Roman law. And it was the same society and culture for the disciples. The Jews continued to push back hard, and ultimately, in the 60s, when Nero became emperor, and beyond Diocletian in the 100s and so on, persecution of the Christians very clearly was directed toward that particular group of people. And they were jailed and beaten and thrown to the lions and crucified for being Christians and for preaching about Jesus. In that kind of a situation, the choice is clear. God or human authority? Well, there's no question. But right now, at least I don't see that there is a parallel in Canadian society to what Paul was experiencing. Pastors do have some protection under Canadian law and under denominational policy, as an example, for whom we can marry. And if we were prosecuted for refusing to perform a marriage not in keeping with biblical teaching, we would have that protection both under Canadian law and under denominational policy. But generally, there's no guaranteed protection for speaking our minds, giving our opinions publicly, or asserting our convictions, biblical though they may be. So I will admit that in Canada we have had some of our rights begun to be eroded. Everybody has equality, everybody has the right to express their convictions, as in live by them, but nobody has a right to say anything that the courts determine will be hate speech. And we've somehow lost the distinction between disagreement and hate. But it's not legal anymore in this country to come out and claim that a particular group is not worshiping the true God, that they would be considered a cult or a false religion, or a whole host of other things, largely surrounding gender identity issues and how people identify and whom they choose to marry and those sorts of things. If I were to speak those things publicly, and conceivably this is a public gathering, I don't have the same kind of protection as I do over choosing not to marry, say, a gay couple. But that's not the situation that Paul was in. In this circumstance, Paul hadn't broken either Jewish laws or Roman laws. But he knew that if he were released into freedom, the Jews would get him and kill him. And so he knew that the protection against the Jews was to invoke his rights and to say, I'm not willing to face you in Jerusalem. There's too much risk in transit. There's too much risk in being there out in the open. The only way to safety is I appeal to Caesar. I appeal to the Supreme Court of Rome. And at that point, there was no choice for them but to transfer him to Rome, and he went there. There was a book that was written a number of years ago to Christians, Have We No Rights? And within limits, we do have them, but we need to be careful about how we clamor for them and in what spirit and over what issues. We don't have a biblical guarantee that we will not face persecution in Canada or around the world. Now, lots of time there are false charges, there's miscarriage of justice. I acknowledge all those things. But the reality is, if we live for Christ and we choose to speak for Christ, we are doing so under his mandate. But he doesn't offer the guarantee that we will be immune from persecution for doing that. Quite the opposite. John 16 talks about the various things that the disciples will face, including Jesus' punishment, death, resurrection, and departure, or ascension. And then at the end of that chapter, Jesus says, but a time is coming and has come when you will be scattered, each to his own home. You will leave me alone, forecasting their abandonment of him and Peter's denial. And then Jesus said, but I am not alone, for my Father is with me. And I've told you all these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I've overcome the world. Our guarantee of safety is that we cannot be touched when we are in Jesus' hands. What do I mean by touched? Yes, we can have hands laid on us, we can be beaten, we can be imprisoned, we can even be executed in this world. But when we trust Jesus, our souls are safe with him, and our eternal security is with God, not in the prevention of evil or harm hitting us while we're living in this life. When I was a young man, just a few years ago, in case you're wondering, I thought that the way that things were going at the time in Canada, we could face persecution. I didn't see some of what we are seeing today coming, but I thought in my lifetime I could see Canada slipping to the point where we could be persecuted for Christian faith, or at least for holding to convictions that weren't consistent with what society seemed to be heading towards. Why is that an issue? Because I don't like persecution. I really don't like pain. Particularly if somebody else imposes it on me, but even if I impose it on myself, I don't like pain. I would have a hard time under the persecution that, say, the Afghan church is going through at this time, or the church in China, or in Nigeria, or India, or Pakistan. A lot of places, people are being tortured, imprisoned, even dying for their faith. But God gives me these comforts. He doesn't give me tomorrow's grace today, but He promises that when I need it, I will have it. So if we ever get to the point where we have to stand up for our faith and to be killed for it, I'm trusting that God will give me that grace at that point in time. But I also have this promise from Jesus in John 16. We will have trouble, but He is going to be present with us through it. And ultimately, the one we love and serve has overcome the world.